Good.
Sounds good. All right. So good morning, everyone. And for those of you who are just joining us, happy Friday. Hopefully we're back in the swing of things after a nice holiday break. Welcome to anyone who's joining us today for the first time. We're so glad you're here. And for those of you who have been joining us regularly for our sessions, we're glad you're back for more. So today's Know Better, Do Better session is episode 7 out of 8. The bit.ly link is at the bottom of the screen, and it will give you access to the slides for today's session. And it will also appear again at the end of the session as well. So if you don't get it this time, it will be coming up soon. I am Sarah Lobaugh. I'm the Literacy and MTSS consultant at the Capital Area Intermediate Unit. And then we also have Amy Healy.
Hi, everyone.
And she is our tax supervisor at the IU as well. So our learning intentions for our sessions are always to address a common practice, explain why it can be problematic, and discuss some research and evidence surrounding best practices and maybe some better practices that can be used instead to support reading, writing, and language for all of our students. So today's topic is independent reading activities. And when we refer to these activities, we're talking about independent reading activities that require students to self-select books to read and then go to an area of the classroom or school and read by themselves for a set length of time. So sometimes these independent reading times are given like familiar names. Sometimes DEAR, sometimes SSR. I remember when I was back in school, it was always SSR time. Squirt, read to self sometimes. So the intended purpose of these times is typically to encourage students to read, right? To practice reading, to gain vocabulary and background knowledge. And sometimes, I've used it, every once in a while as a filler time, right? Or during transition times, or sometimes it may occur during a center or a station when other students are meeting with the teacher. And you might be thinking, well, geez, I've done that for years, and that's fine. But we just want you to consider a few important aspects when having students read independently. So I'm going to ask you to raise your hand either virtually or in person if you have ever had trouble with behavior or engagement when students are reading during those times, right? So I see lots of hands, right? And probably a lot of you, right? So what's the problem with these types of independent reading times? Well, first, we want to consider what's known as the Matthew effect. So some of you may know that as the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. From the Bible is where it actually comes from. So our best readers tend to read the most and be more engaged in what they're reading, whereas our weaker readers tend to read the least, right? And so when we consider our weaker or even low average readers during these independent reading times, the weaker reader most likely won't be able to use that time as effectively as a stronger reader will. And so they end up disengaging from the activity or fake reading. Sometimes when we are asking students to select books, right? Select books for read to self time, and lo and behold, 5 minutes in, none of the books they chose are good or interesting. And they read them all in 5 minutes, right? Not. So an unengaging book choice can also lead to behavior issues. And then another thing to consider with these independent reading activities are with its effectiveness. So studies suggest that independent reading times are not as effective as more controlled reading practice or reading with a teacher. And so Amy is going to talk a little bit more about how the effect size of good instructional practices in reading and language are as opposed to independent reading time, it can actually good instructional practices and supported reading time can actually have almost a 400% greater effect than actually just reading to self sometimes. So the more independent reading practices are like effective reading instruction, the more powerful they're likely to be, which basically means sometimes, we might be able for some students to use our time a little bit more effectively and efficiently. So we're not saying like don't ever do independent reading time, but definitely consider some of the research and some of the abilities of your students and some of these better practices that might be helpful instead. So here's Amy, and she is going to talk a little bit more about the research behind independent reading, and then we'll go into some practices that might be useful to you.
All right, so the research. So what does the research say? Well, there is actually correlational evidence that the best readers read the most and the poor readers read the least. I think probably everybody on here can agree that they have seen that firsthand, that the really strong readers are the ones that are often reading off more, and the ones who are struggling aren't going to choose to read, right? So what this means in correlational evidence is, okay, you read more, that's going to lead to better vocabulary. It's going to be linked to increased knowledge. And overall, we're going to have improved reading ability. But I want you to keep in mind that this is correlational evidence. So there's a difference between correlation and causation. So in correlational evidence, yes, there's something about these things that link to each other. However, we're not saying that reading more causes students to have improved reading achievement. So think of it this way with this question. Is it possible to have a student that's reading more and not become a better reader? Now, I'm sure if you really think about that, you can probably think of examples of students in your classroom right now that maybe they're reading and they're participating in independent reading activities, or maybe they choose to read a lot, but you're not seeing their growth, their reading achievement matched to that. And there's probably reasons behind that. So encouraging reading and reading a lot doesn't necessarily mean that reading achievement will result. But like I said, there is correlational evidence that these things do have some links to them. So the National Reading Panel back in 2000 reviewed hundreds of studies, and the panel did meta-analysis, all these studies to look at what do we need to have in reading instruction. And that's where the Fab Five really comes out of. Um, Phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary comprehension, and fluency. And there's a lot more to the reading panel report than just that. It digs a little deeper. It's a very, very large, thick report. One of those parts about fluency also took a look at encouraging reading and reading achievement because of this correlation versus causation. And they found 14 experimental studies at the time that focused on encouraging reading through some sort of program, such as doing SSR, DEAR, Book It, Accelerated Reader. There were several of them they named. I pulled out the ones that I think are most commonly known to us. And what they found is that they concluded that there is no clear evidence. And that's, a little shocking that you would think that, oh, well, if you read a lot, you're going to improve in reading. But on all of these studies, there was no clear evidence, again, that causation. So since then, there has also been some more studies to kind of replicate and take a look at, does encouraging reading improve reading achievement? And there has been a few studies that have found positive impacts, but as if you look at that top bullet there, the effect sizes are very, very minimal. So you see a 0.14 and a 0.05. That is extremely small. So a positive impact, but a very, very, very small one like that doesn't really mean much in the end. We typically look in the hinge point, according to John Hattie's work, point 0.4 and higher as being those effective high impact strategies that we want to make sure. So something like a 0.14 and a 0.05 isn't much of an impact at all. Then if you take a look at the second bullet, when we looked at the studies that looked at interventions where kids were taught skills like phonics skills and fluency skills and reading comprehension skills, those effects tended to be in the 0.4 and higher, which you can tell is so much higher, 3 to 8 times higher than just doing self-selected reading. So pretty interesting, I think. There has also been studies that took a look at summer reading programs, and interestingly, they found the same results. And also, and not to get deep into this one, but kind of like a throw it out there with conferencing, and there hasn't been research studies that support its effectiveness. Now, all of this said sounds like don't do independent reading, right? Now, keep in mind, we talked about correlation versus causation. Yes, there's no clear evidence to say encouraging reading is linked to reading achievement, but we know there's some correlation in there. So that's not to say that there wouldn't be benefits. You know, how can it not be a good thing to have books in the hands of kids and reading, right? It's a hard thing to say that there isn't benefits. So I really want you to think about, like Sarah was saying, how we're doing independent reading, how we're having kids use that time, or how we as educators are using that time. So some better practices that we're going to share. This first one, and it's a big paragraph here, but I really like how Tim Shanahan broke this down. So first of all, we all want our kids to have a love of reading. And in order for them to love reading, they have to know how to read, right? So that's the very first thing. If you really want kids to love reading, first you got to teach them to read, because if you don't like to read, you're not going to love reading. So think about that with kids during independent reading time, right? They're not going to be reading their books sitting there if they really don't love reading in the first place. Achievement does more for motivation than the other way around. So if you're really good at something, you're going to be motivated to do more of it. You know, you think about something outside of education, like playing a sport. If you're not good at playing, say, basketball, you're not going to choose that as your fun thing to do typically, right? So when you're really good at something, you tend to want to do it more. Set up opportunities for kids to work together and to work with you around books. Encourage them to include reading in their daily lives when they're not with you, when they're away from school. And if you really want them to care about books, give them a chance to take on books that might be too hard for them, but that they think is worth the effort. So it's okay if a student wants to read a book that you might say is, whoa, that is way too hard for that student, but they have that motivation um, to want to read it. Now, if it's really, really too hard and then you're going to help guide them with that book, or you might choose to partner read with that book or have them listen to that book. And then give them ways to gain social rewards for using knowledge they gain from their reading. So what are they going to do with this information? They're learning through reading the book, but now they need to do something with that knowledge, have a purpose with it, whether it's in writing or in discussion or expanding that knowledge. Some other better practices too, instead of doing something like SSR, use that time for instruction or for small groups, especially with those struggling readers. So maybe you have some kids that are actually doing independent reading, but the kids who need to be taught how to read would be better served working with you in a small group. Matching kids with decodable text is another thing that you could do, having text in their hands that they are able to read and practice. Here's a big one, and we're not going to go into much right now because this is actually going to come up in our last session next week. We're really excited about this, is to try the partner reading intervention routine. So just know for now that this is a type of partner reading, paired reading. Um, but we will discuss this in detail next week. And then we also are offering a training at the IU specifically around this reading intervention. And just to give you a little bit, there has been some schools in the area that have used this partner reading intervention and have seen successful gains with their students. And then the last one is teacher read alouds and using that for discussion and vocabulary and building background knowledge. Jan Hasbrook, she suggests that teachers should provide opportunities for students to read aloud, but with guidance and feedback. And that guidance and feedback are very, very important. So that's different than the old school thinking of, drop everything and read, and we're all reading at the same time. And instead working with a teacher to have that guidance and feedback. This process of having that guidance and feedback is part of a strategy called guided repeated oral reading practice. Not to be confused with guided reading. Guided repeating oral reading practice is a teacher and a student working together with a repeated reading. The teacher is providing that guided support and helping them along the way and giving them that feedback. We have something in the resources to help with that a little bit here in a few seconds. And then doing some other repeated reading procedures. The National Reading Panel in these studies, when they were looking at fluency, repeated readings is one of the best ways to increase fluency. And some of these strategies were discussed. So doing repeated readings, the neurological impress method, and there's something in our resources to help with that one. But in short, what happens with the neurological impress method is there's a teacher and a student reading together, and the teacher is slightly faster and slightly louder as they're reading together. And then paired reading, again, we'll talk about more of that next week, and shared reading opportunities where you can read all together with the class. All right, so resources here. So this first page, you have all of these things are linked. So make sure you have the bit.ly with the presentation. So you can click on each of these. The first one, first two actually are Tim Shanahan. And the first one is a blog post that leads to Reading Rockets. And he had shared a lot on here. If you know Tim Shanahan, he is a very popular, well-known researcher, and he does a lot of blog posts of his own website, which is on the second bullet there, does independent reading during the day, create lifelong readers. And in these, he shares in an informal way, what the research does say and what his suggestions are. He's very controversial too, so it's always an interesting read that when you can read any of his blogs that he has. The third one is Jan Hasbrook, and she had shared some things there that you can take a look at as well. That's a good resource. The fourth one is the partner reading intervention session that we're offering here at the IU. And that gives you some information about that. Registration for that is open on our frontline system. So the same place where you registered for this, you can register for that coming up in February. And again, we'll talk about that one next week. And then the last one, Dr. Maria Murray, who is one of the co-founders of the Reading League, has this great presentation. It's about an hour long about using read alouds. So some research you can check out there. On the next page here, we have a lot of other resources that you can use for your classroom. So the left-hand side here, the first one, ReadWorks. If you're not familiar with ReadWorks, they have articles that you can select. You need to set up an account. One of the things we really like is article of the day. And so you can select You can see on the screen, there's a lot of article a day that you can choose, but they actually have a routine that can go along with these, and lots of other things, little quizzes and such like that that you can use. The neurological impress method that I described, this is a quick little video of a teacher working with a student modeling this. So if you wanted to take a look at what that looked like. The next one is the guided repeated oral reading, and this just from Reading Rockets shares some steps of what that is. You can go back and take a look if you couldn't remember what those are. And then the next one is an actual video showing that as well. And then the one after that is a repeated reading video that you can take a look at as well if you wanted to. And this is actually for an adult, that you can take a look and see how this process worked. On the right-hand side, first of all, the read aloud routine. This is a really great resource that we came across that we wanted to share with you that you can use as part of your read alouds to help. And it goes through all of the before, during, and after procedures. So we thought this was a fabulous resource that we came across and could be helpful. And then the other three are all FCRR. You know, we like FCRR.org and their student-centered activities. The picture one is linked. And then the other links, they all go to some fluency activities. And we pulled out a couple of them. There's many more there that you could focus on. So this one here is really like, because it talks about ways that you can practice fluent reading through doing some of those different activities and having kids be the leader. The other one is how we can look at reading results. So having kids monitor, and so there's like charts in here that they can use for their own progress monitoring. All right. And then the last one there is that one. I think that one's linked, Sarah, too, that you can take a look at. It's just another one about fluency. All right. So let's wrap up now. And next week, we will be focusing on the topic of buddy reading. So like we've already kind of shared, the partner reading routine is going to come in there. So we'll talk about, some of the problems that we see with buddy reading and ways that we can kind of do that instead. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today, and hopefully we gave you some things to consider as you are looking at your independent reading time and how we can kind of adjust that. The bit.ly for this is at the bottom of the screen, so if you didn't get the slides, make sure you get that before you go. And again, we'll have one more session next Friday. I hope you can join us. Just remember, like we always say, do the best you can until you know better, and then when you know better, do better. So awesome seeing everybody this morning. Have a wonderful day and hope to see you next week. Bye, everyone.
Have a good weekend.
You too, Dan.
Thanks, ladies.